whatever the committee wants to do, because I'm telling the truth.
I want to know what you want to do.
I'm telling the truth.
I want to know what you want to do, Judge.
I'm innocent. I'm innocent of this charge.
Then you're prepared for an FBI investigation?
They don't reach conclusions. You reach the conclusions.
No,
Senator.
but they do investigate questions.
ABC News political analyst. We usually check in with him on Mondays, but on special occasions, we press him into duty. Stephen Roberts, not the Senate's finest hour yesterday.
Not even close. I mean, I've covered, as you know, the Senate for many years. I covered it for the New York Times for 10 years in the 80s. Normally, there is a veneer, at least, of cordiality and mutual respect. That was totally absent yesterday. In all my years covering Congress, I have never seen a session where the hostility and animosity and the lack of regard across the aisle was so tangible and so palpable. Started with Senator Chuck Grassley basically accusing Dianne Feinstein, the ranking Democrat, of dishonesty, and it went from there and kept escalating. And this is emblematic of a much larger trend in our politics. The center of the Senate has been hollowed out for years. There are virtually no progressive Republicans left, with the exception of someone like Susan Collins of Maine. There are very few conservative Southern Democrats left. Those were the two kinds of senators who bridged the gaps, who were the deal makers, the consensus builders, and virtually none of them are left in the U.S. Senate. And you saw how yesterday on display, the Senate at its worst and most dysfunctional.
I think, and I think it looked like Dr. Ford and Kavanaugh and the rest of us were just pawns in this death match between the two of them.
Well, but a death match with enormously important stakes. There were two audiences yesterday for that event. One was just the U.S. Senate itself, where there's a handful of senators, maybe 3 or 4 Republicans at most, a couple of Democrats, who might still have a certain level of indecision. I think in the end, the odds favor Kavanaugh being confirmed, because I think this is so important, so vitally important to the president, who is pushing very hard, and to the Republican base. If you look at the election 16, I looked at the exit polls, and about 21% of Americans said the court was the most important issue they were voting on, and they voted overwhelmingly by 20 points for Donald Trump. This issue is absolutely central to the core base of the Republican Party, particularly religious conservatives. 26% of Americans in the last election described themselves as born-again or evangelical Christians, and 80% of them, McGraw, 80% voted for Donald Trump. So that gives you a sense of how important Republicans feel about the court and in getting Kavanaugh onto the bench. If you look at Clarence Thomas, who was approved by only 2 votes in the U.S. Senate, he got 52 votes. 27 years later, he is still on the court. Brett Kavanaugh is 53 years old. He could serve another 25 years himself, or 27 years. So that's why the stakes are so high. But they could pay a price with voters, McGraw.
So I think Kavanaugh's worst moment was when he went after Klobuchar, and I think the Democrats' worst moment clearly has to be Sheldon Whitehouse.
Well, I certainly agree on Klobuchar. I think he's one of the few members of the Senate who acted with dignity yesterday. And there are a number of people who think, as they look toward the 2020, as the Democratic field, which is vast, with a number of women aspiring to run for president, some very smart people think that Amy Klobuchar actually is the highest quality potential candidate in that field. And she certainly did herself some good yesterday. But the other factor to remember is that there is a whole other audience for this event on national television, and we're going to have a critical election in the beginning of November. And women voters were already fleeing from Kavanaugh. Fox News poll, very interesting. 50% of Americans said they opposed Kavanaugh, which is the first time in history of polling that there's been a majority of voters against any Supreme Court nominee. But that number jumps to 56% among women and 60% among white college-educated women. As we've talked before, this is the group in the suburbs of St. Louis, the suburbs of Minneapolis, the suburbs of Denver, suburbs of Philadelphia, who are going to decide the makeup of the U.S. House in this fall. And I have to believe that a certain number of those women, watching Blasey Ford, watching her talk about the boys laughing uproariously at her expense, that moment, that image, that memory is only going to inflame and energize more women who are already moving away from Kavanaugh and the Republicans to accelerate that move. And so Republicans might win the battle within the Senate, but it could really cost them in the fall election.
Stephen Roberts, we'll talk to you on Monday. Have a good weekend. Thanks.
Okay.